The high score by the National Rally was not unexpected. Polls had predicted that. What was totally stunning, however, was Macron's decision to dissolve the parliament. He was under no obligation to do that.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Elections for the European Parliament saw sweeping gains for far-right parties in Germany and France. And it was in France that these elections led to the surprising and very daring decision by Emmanuel Macron to dissolve Parliament and call for snap elections. The first round of these legislative elections will be held on June 30th. Macron is facing a challenge from the far-right National Rally, a party that used to be known as the National Front and which was founded by the Nazi-adjacent Jean-Marie Le Pen and is now led by his daughter Marine Le Pen. These elections could lead to the far-right winning enough seats in French Parliament to lead a government. On the line to discuss the European Parliament elections in general and the results in France in particular is Art Goldhammer, a senior affiliate at the Center for European Studies at Harvard. He explains the political dynamics leading up to these snap elections, and we have a long conversation about the implications for Europe and the world should France be led by the hard-right National Rally. So if you are listening to this contemporaneously, the next episode of this podcast will be the first episode of my new podcast about the United Nations, To Save Us from Hell. This is the new project of Global Dispatches, and it is a weekly chat show in which co-host Anjali Dayal and I discuss all things United Nations, giving you expert takes on events and news around the UN and the UN system. To Save Us from Hell has its own separate podcast feed, but for these first couple episodes, we're going to drop the show right into this feed. And I'd encourage you all to visit globaldispatches.org/saveus to access our new show, which is being hosted on Substack. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Art Goldhammer, senior affiliate at the Center for European Studies at Harvard. Thanks again for joining me, Art. I'd like to kick off by having you explain what happened in the EU elections in general, and then a little later we'll discuss France in particular.
Well, before the election took place, there were widespread fears that the result would lead to a significant increase in the power of the far right across Europe. In the event that did not happen, there were some advances by the far right, but the two far right groupings in the European Parliament, the European Conservatives and Reformists and Identity and Democracy, gained only 7 seats between them out of 720. So that was not a significant advance. However, you have to keep in mind that the European Parliament is really the least important of the European institutions. More important are the European Commission and the Council of Ministers of the European Union, where the real power lies. And therefore, what happens at the national level in each of the national elections is important because it affects the balance of power in the Council of Ministers. And what we saw in last Sunday's election was gains for the far right parties in both Germany and France, which traditionally have been regarded as the engine of the European Union, the Franco-German couple is often spoken of as the locomotive that makes Europe go.
That's how it all started.
Yeah, that's how it all started. They were two of the original six. So there are now 27 member states, but France and Germany, because of their larger populations, still wield disproportionate influence. So what we saw in Germany was a significant advance by the Alternative for Deutschland.
That's the far right German party.
Yes, initials are AfD, so I will refer to it hereafter by those initials. They gained 16%, which was a historic high for them. And they've expanded their influence out of the former Eastern German enclave, in which the party has long been powerful, and have begun to attract a following in other parts of Germany. So that's an advance, but not enough of an advance to shake the hold on power of what's called the traffic light coalition,
Yeah.
which consists of the Social Democratic Party, the Greens, and the Free Democrats, neoliberal party. So they still remain firmly in power, although the Social Democrats scored their worst results since the end of World War II. It was really pretty devastating for Olaf Scholz, who's the chancellor. In France, however, the situation is altogether more dramatic because there, the National Rally Party, which is the descendant of what was once called the National Front, the party founded by extreme radical right leader Jean Marie Le Pen, the leadership has now passed to his daughter, Marine Le Pen, who ran against Macron twice in the last two presidential elections. She's now turned over the reins of the party to a young assistant, a 28-year-old Jordan Bardella, who led the ticket of the national rally in last Sunday's election.
And they did surprisingly well. What were the results in France in particular? And what do you suspect explains the election results that were so favorable to this party?
To begin with, the result, the national rally got 31.4%, which was more than double the score of Macron's party, which goes by various names.
Yeah. These European parties are always changing their names. I like the name En Marche personally. And now it's called the Renaissance Party, and the National Rally used to be called the Front National. It's tripping me up.
It is a problem for those of us who try to write about European politics. My friend Daniel Zeiblatt says that it's a sign of weak institutionalization, and that's certainly the case with Macron's party. I think his fundamental mistake since his election is that he has paid too little attention to trying to build up the party structure that supported him. When it was called the Republic En Marche, it was really a personal vehicle that served his purposes in running for president. And once he got there, he forgot about it. He didn't do much to build it up at the local level. And that's one of the things that's made him so weak and led to the devastating defeat. The other thing that I think accounts for the rise of the Front National is simply the level of animosity that has grown against Macron, particularly since his reelection in 2022. There are a number of reasons for that. One is that because in 2022, the legislative elections gave him less than an absolute majority. So he has only a relative working majority of 250, short of the 289 votes he needs. So, on a certain number of key measures like retirement reform, he was forced to resort to a provision of the Constitution known as Article 49.3, which allows the government to push through measures without majority support.
Hmm.
And that aroused considerable resentment in the country. The other thing that has worked against Macron is simply his personality. He's arrogant, he's a narcissist. He demonstrated that again in the press conference he gave yesterday, in which, as usual, he was in great form. He answered questions at length without notes. Journalists often asked him questions with many parts, and he managed to respond at great length to each of these questions, recalling without having taken any notes all of the points of the questions that were put to him. He's brilliant that way, but the problem is that his very brilliance reminds people of how they were put down in the past by teachers or by the top student in the class. He just represents a certain type of French success associated with what they call the grandes écoles, which places great emphasis on performance in the classroom to the detriment of other kinds of political experience. So Macron has managed to polarize around himself a very high level of animosity, despite the fact that his reform program has been, all in all, rather modestly technocratic.
Hmm.
The past president he most reminds me of is Giscard d'Estaing, who had a similarly modest program of reforms, which arguably tended in a direction that was necessary to adapt France to changing international conditions, but which, because of the president's personality, somehow mobilized opposition against him greater than the mere substance of his program would account for. Macron himself is part of the problem.
So, in the face of the really stunning election results by the National Rally, Macron announced that he'd be dissolving parliament and there'll be new elections just in the coming weeks. First, can you explain precisely what happened, why it was so surprising, and what, if any, kind of political calculus Macron is invoking to justify this position and this kind of surprise move?
The high score by the National Rally was not unexpected. Polls had predicted that. What was totally stunning, however, was Macron's decision to dissolve the parliament. He was under no obligation to do that. He could have continued to rule as he has been with his relative working majority. Now, in doing that, he was, in a sense, harking back to the president who has, in many ways, been his model, the founder of the Fifth Republic, Charles de Gaulle. When de Gaulle was faced with an uprising in May of 1968, he responded by dissolving parliament and calling for new elections, and that paid off for him handsomely.
And Macron's arrogant enough that he can believe he can summon de Gaulle.
He believed he could summon the ghost of de Gaulle. The problem is that the situation now is entirely different. Then there was an uprising by young leftists who really threatened the party of order, as it were, the comfortable bourgeoisie, who really were afraid that the government might be violently overthrown. The situation this time is totally different. There are no scruffy revolutionaries in the streets, although there may well be within a few weeks. There is Macron himself, who wears impeccably tailored suits and is a graduate of the top schools in France. So it's the government itself that is seen as the sower of disorder in France, and the party of order may want to get rid of the government. Anyway, the parliament has now been dissolved. That power is given to the president by the Constitution. When the parliament is dissolved, he has between 30 and 60 days to call for new elections, and he chose the short end of that window, thus throwing the entire political system into total disarray. The parties now have only 3 weeks. The first round of voting will occur on June 30th. So the parties have less than 3 weeks at this point to organize legislative elections to elect deputies for the 589 seats, I believe it is, in the National Assembly. And that has caused an explosion of the party system.
So basically, this was like a big gamble. This is a big gamble by Macron. There's no guarantee that the anti National Rally coalition will win. And it's a very decent likelihood that the National Rally will do quite well in these elections. Could I just have you explain what are their both domestic policy priorities and how much of a radical shift in French politics would it mean for the National Rally to gain power in Parliament?
First, I should say that it's very hard to predict the number of seats that will be won. Despite the 30 plus point showing of the National Rally in Sunday's election, the voting system is totally different in the legislative elections. It's a two-round affair, for one thing, and the parties are in the throes of reorganizing themselves. So it's really very difficult to predict how the election is going to turn out. But to accept your premise that the National Rally turns out to be the most powerful party in Parliament, what's likely to happen is that they will make an offer to the president to form a government with Bardella, the party president, as prime minister. If that happens, Macron is not obliged to accept their offer. He can try to put together a different coalition, but I think the most likely outcome is that he will accept. His calculation in doing so would likely be that in the past, presidents have used appointments to the prime ministership to weaken their rivals. Mitterrand was a master at this. He was challenged by Michel Rocard. He made Michel Rocard, who was a member of his own party, the Socialists, prime minister, and then undermined him at every turn. That is a strategy available to Macron. He can make Bargala prime minister, allow the National Rally to implement its program, which, it has to be said, contained any number of incoherent policies,
Yeah.
and use that as a way to undermine them.
It's like the National Rally, like the dog that caught the car kind of thing. Like, all right, they're in power now. Like, what are they actually going to do? They have no plan, no idea.
Right. So they do have some ideas. One is to restrict immigration. That's always been their stock in trade.
Mhm.
The problem is that Macron has already compromised on that point. The National Assembly passed an immigration reform bill recently. It was quite controversial, but it did get passed with the help of the Republican Party, in addition to support from Macron's own centrist party. Of course, the National Rally will try to restrict immigration even further, at least symbolically. But as far as legal restrictions go, the recent reform bill has gone a long way toward implementing their demands. It will also try to introduce into law some kind of system of national preference in hiring. That is, French born citizens will be given systematic preference in hiring decisions by private companies.
Hmm.
It's not sure that they can get that passed through Parliament with the less than absolute majority they're likely to have. They'll certainly tighten enforcement of law and order laws. The National Rally has strong support within the French police. One of their candidates announced today was a former anti organized crime cop in Marseille. So they'll make a big issue of law and order and crack down on particularly what's seen as disorder in the largely immigrant suburbs of the large cities.
Basically, your typical kind of right wing menu of options when you've secured some power. But in terms of France's relationship to the EU and to the European Union, what are their priorities? Are they sort of hell bent on leaving the EU?
No, they're not. Before the 2017 election, Marine Le Pen flirted with the idea of leaving the EU, a so called Frexit option. But that didn't work well for her in that campaign. And since then, they've abandoned
Hmm.
all thought of leaving the European Union. Instead, what's most likely to happen is that Le Pen would use her influence through the Council of Ministers to join forces with other far right parties across Europe, particularly Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party in Italy and Viktor Orban's Fidesz party in Hungary.
Hmm.
Those three would lead a far right option within the Council of Ministers of the European Union and try to tighten immigration restrictions at the European level, for example. That's one direction they would go. The most dangerous possibility is that there would be a withdrawal of support from Ukraine.
Hmm.
Now, I have to moderate that point a bit by noting that until now, Giorgia Meloni has been quite strong in support of Ukraine and has supported European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, even met with Zelensky together with von der Leyen. So it's not clear what direction Meloni would go. And Meloni and Le Pen have not seen eye to eye on all issues.
Hmm.
In fact, since the parties we're talking about are all nationalist, populist parties, they have their own national interests to put ahead of the interests of other countries. So, a nationalist coalition at the center of a transnational organization like the European Union is sort of a contradiction in terms.
Hmm.
And the differences between these right wing nationalist parties would likely become prominent if the National Rally should come to power.
So it's interesting, as you noted, there is this difference, obviously, in approach to Ukraine and how you consider Ukraine with Orban and his party being a little more conciliatory towards Russia. Maloney, thus far, siding with most of the rest of Europe and supporting Ukraine. Do you foresee whoever might lead a national front in France being kind of like the wild card, though, that they could go either way. They could go the more direction of Orban, or go more the direction of Maloney, who again has been kind of that bridge between the far right in Europe and is able to still support Ukraine.
Yes, I think you make a very good point. I think France under the National Rally would be a wild card, and it's hard to predict which way they would go. Macron is certainly trying to emphasize the past ties between the National Rally, between Le Pen in particular, and Putin. During the presidential campaign, there was a picture of Le Pen shaking hands with Putin that was widely circulated and used to discredit her, along with the fact that the National Rally had borrowed money from Russian banks to finance its campaign. Le Pen has been sympathetic to Russia in the past, but she's soft pedaled that recently since the outbreak of war in Ukraine. And I think her strategy in general has been to try to soften her image as much as possible and trying to move toward the center in France in the hope of expanding her electoral base. That strategy has worked very well, and I think it would encourage her to be very cautious on changing the direction of France with regard to Ukraine. It also has to be said that there is a division of power between the president and the prime minister, the government, in the case of a cohabitation, as the French like to call it. When the presidency and the government are run by different parties, the president has what's called a reserve domain in the realm of foreign and defense policy. So Macron would still be calling the shots in determining policy with respect to Ukraine, but he could be undermined and countered if Le Pen tried to do that because of the power wielded in the ministries and over the budget by the government, which would then be run by the National Rally. So there would be a tug of war at the center of the French government should Le Pen decide that she's had enough of supporting Ukraine and wants to swing back to support of Russia.
So, is there anything else you would want to emphasize in terms of the broader significance of these forthcoming French elections, particularly on foreign policy, but more broadly about anything else?
I think the lesson of this is that one has to be careful about electing centrist governments. I was all for Macron's strategy in 2017. I thought it made a great deal of sense to try to create a force at the center of French politics because many voters perceived the center right and center left parties that had been competing for power for the previous 20 years to have had very similar policies. And Macron perceived that and said, well, why don't we draw from the rightmost elements of the left and the leftmost elements of the right and put together something entirely new? That had the appeal of novelty in 2017. But unfortunately, the way it's evolved is that because of the way Macron has played the politics of the situation, he's tended to cast all of his opponents as being part of the radical extreme. He's dismissed even the more moderate elements of the left as radical leftists and tried to characterize the National Rally as fascist. In the meantime, the National Rally has moved toward the center and, in the eyes of many voters, became indistinguishable from the former center right party known as the Republicans. So there is a big danger of trying to govern from the center and to cast your opposition as radical. It means that voters cease to see the possibility of democratic alternation. And if they become dissatisfied with the centrist government, they have no choice but to look to what is being characterized by the center as extreme. So I think that's the lesson of the Macron presidency and what seems at the moment to be its failure.
So, lastly, I know you're a comparative politics person. To what extent do you consider these elections in France any sort of harbinger for what we can expect here in the United States in November?
Well, frankly, I think American Republicans have become much more radical than Marine Le Pen and her National Rally Party. Le Pen has moderated her position and moved away from the more violent putschist rhetoric of her father. The American Republicans have moved in the opposite direction under Donald Trump. What's more, I think there's more toleration for dissent and diversity of opinion within the National Rally Party than there is within today's American Republican Party. So, in what is almost a perverse way, I think the American Republicans would do well to evolve toward Le Pen rather than the other way around. In 2017, Le Pen made overtures to Trump. She flew to New York to meet with Trump after his election, but he rejected her. Steve Bannon, who was then his close lieutenant, did become involved in advising both Le Pen and Meloni in Europe. But since then, the European parties have moved in a more moderate direction, and the American Republican Party has moved in a more radical direction, to my mind.
Hmm.
That's the way I see the comparative situation.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, as always, for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.